right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm an academic trainer for the Center for Teaching and Learning. And we are here with our very own Dr. Shari Schwartz, who is going to be presenting her webinar today on Perspective is Subjective, our relative inability to objectively evaluate people, places, and things. And for today's webinar, she's encouraging you all to participate in the chat and in ask questions in the Q&A. And then when Dr. Schwartz feels like it's a good time to pause, she'll ask me if there's any questions in the Q&A. So please do keep them rolling in there. And aside from that, just a very brief reminder that this is being recorded and we are going to put it in our CTL LibGuides webinar section for future reference and for those that couldn't be here with us today that want to view it later. So without any more announcements, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Schwartz.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining. As Emily said, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the subjectivity in our perspective and how it's almost impossible to separate being human and being subjective. We like to think we can make decisions objectively, but the research shows pretty clearly that we're not usually very successful in doing that and the impact there. But a little bit about me, just so you know, I have the pleasure of teaching in the forensic psychology program here at NCU. I love it. I'm also a full-time college professor elsewhere, and I have my own business, my own legal consulting business, where as a forensic psychologist, I work on capital mitigation in murder cases. Death penalty cases is really my specialty, but I do some juvenile cases, juveniles who have killed people who are facing life without parole. I live in Miami Beach, Florida. I don't love to exercise, but I do exercise because I do love to eat. So there's that. But I've really developed this passion for high intensity interval training. But I have run a couple of marathons. Don't think I'll ever do that again. It was great, but you know, the training is a killer. And of course, my Rudy, you may see Rudy or hear him during the presentation, or his adopted siblings. I have 4 of them. They're community cats. We have a community cat problem, I guess, or heavy population in Miami Beach. And so basically there's a whole group of us that goes around and takes care of community cats, and my guys were people who couldn't be, or kitties that couldn't be outside anymore. Rudy's my deaf kitty. And so sometimes he just meows really loudly because he can't hear himself. Perhaps my most, well, this will show you the subjectivity in perception and perspective. I think the most exciting and interesting thing about me lately is that I recently appeared on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace. You all might be like, oh, big deal. But to me, this was a big deal. So yeah, so that's me. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about how inherent subjectivity in perceptions influences, hello, how did that happen? Influences our decision making. Sorry about that, guys. My mouse is a little bit, let me take my hands off of that. How the inherent subjectivity in our perceptions influences our decision making, and that recognizing and minimizing the impact of our own stuff, our triggers, recognizing that these are potential barriers to equity and inclusion, really. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later, and also how to value others' lived experiences with this eye toward equity and inclusion. And probably the vast majority of you, if not all of you in the room, feel that you're doing that already, and you may be, but the fact is we do have as humans some limitations, and one of those is that we often feel that, oh, I'm not biased, and this doesn't really apply to me. This applies to other people. But I think you'll find through the talk that it probably does apply to you and to me and to all of us. So I'm going to use, I like to sort of talk about these things through interesting examples. And this is probably something you've all encountered at some point or another, but I'm going to set it in the backdrop of this case of the instructor versus the student, and the boxing match, right? Because sometimes it can feel like that, right? When you're sort of having this battle of the wills with students, or you're perceiving that students are trying to take advantage. And sometimes it's not just your perception and the subjectivity therein. It might be that there are some students who are trying to take advantage, but there are some students who aren't trying to take advantage. And even if they are, let's talk a little bit about that and how that might trigger us, right? So in this particular case, where I'm full-time faculty, I happen to be the program lead of the Social and Criminal Justice program and the Master's in Criminal Justice program. And this happened a while back. Anytime there's a grade appeal or some sort of academic issue where a student contacts the university with a complaint about an instructor, or they want to appeal their grade, something like that, if it's pertaining to one of my programs, it comes to me. And so I review these fairly often. And I do like to believe that I'm very objective when I'm reviewing these. And it's a process. You constantly have to remind yourself that probably not. So what are my triggers? What's setting me off? And this was a case that really stood out, which is why I want to share it with you and use it as an example here, because this one triggered me in a number of ways. Or set off some of my triggers. But I really want to kind of talk to you guys about it because I know that you have probably seen things like this before. So just to give you a little bit of background, the complaint that came in, the student wasn't asking for a grade change or anything. She was really sharing her experience, her very negative experience in her view of this particular class that she took. It was her first class in the Master's in Criminal Justice program. She had been an undergraduate student and graduated from the university, but it had been a while. She had gone off and was working and then came back for the master's. And so she had really high expectations and a really negative experience. Part of what shaped that negative experience, and she was insightful enough to recognize that she was just having a tough time life-wise, as many of us were through the pandemic. But during that time, she had lost 3 different family members, not all the COVID, and at different times throughout the year, but it had been a really rough year for her. 3 deaths of close family members. And so, and there was that added issue of not being able to go to the hospital because of COVID. And so there was a lot happening for this particular student. And she's a very proud person, I came to know from talking to her. So although she did share with the instructor and say, look, I'm really struggling, when she needed to turn in something late, she would ask for an extension and say, I'm really sorry, this is not me, but I need this extra time if you can give it to me, because I'm really struggling emotionally. And this 3rd family member that passed, she was in the midst, in the first couple of weeks of the course, of burying that family member and all of that. So she was really in the thick of grieving. So, and she started the course, quite frankly, because I'm anticipating that people will say, well, she shouldn't have started the course. Okay, maybe yes, but she did it because she felt like this would be a distraction for her, welcome distraction to be able to help her cope. And, best intentions, it actually was quite stressful for her because she was also trying to work. So I reached out to the instructor and I said, hey, do you remember the student? Because by the time these complaints come to me, it could be a couple of months. That's another story for another day. That's not a very efficient process, but that's not the topic, right? So I say, okay, do you remember this student? There seems to have been some issue with deaths in her family and she needed additional time. What can you tell me about what you remember? Particularly with the final paper, she feels like she was really graded unfairly on that. And the instructor responded by email. And I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but this is basically the instructor saying to me, yes, that's what happened. I gave her extensions when she asked. She submitted the paper, the final late, didn't ask for an extension. The paper was only partially completed. I graded it with deductions based on the rubric. I marked it late. Then she said I shouldn't have marked it late, but it was late. She didn't ask me for an extension. The paper was too short. I felt like I was being generous. I know it sounds like I'm unsympathetic, but I gave her many extensions. She didn't always ask. One of the things she says, I did not ask to confirm the deaths, so I'm not sure if they happened. Of course, they give the benefit of the doubt. This was, I'm going to tell on myself a lot throughout this, you guys. I don't expect you to tell on yourselves. I'm going to tell on myself a lot. I saw that and I was like, uh-oh, there's a trigger for me. The bottom line for me was that she didn't ask for an extension and didn't even put forth the effort to complete a full paper. Another trigger for me. If she had done more content detail, she would have received a higher grade. And I'm not trying to get down on the instructor. I really, I've dealt with these situations before in my own teaching. We can get a little battle weary from hearing all the time that, you know, somebody died. We hear that excuse a lot. I feel like that's a pretty common reason why students need extensions. I have a death in my family. But, you know, it may be the most common because that's usually when you do need that extra time, when you really need some patience and understanding. And I didn't always feel that way. It's taken me a lot to get to that point. So don't give me too much credit for being, you know, highly evolved, right? And so, you know, she's saying, you know, like all she wants is the late penalty waive. So hang on to that as we talk a little bit about subjectivity and objectivity. We're going to circle back to the example. But let's talk a little bit about specifically defining subjectivity and objectivity. These are philosophical concepts. If you've taken a philosophy course, you know that, you know, whether it's a 6 or a 9, this is the kind of discussion that you have in a philosophy class. But the fact is, the topic of subjectivity versus objectivity is one of the most widely researched topics of psychological inquiry. Especially in social psychology, we're very, very interested in how subjectivity in our, first of all, how we arrive at being so subjective, and then how does this impact, how do our opinions, our beliefs, our thoughts, our feelings, these unsubstantiated personal opinions rather than evidence-based facts, how do these influence how we judge others, how we navigate the world, how we see ourselves? In the entire social psychology body of research is focused very much on this. What we need to know for practical purposes, though, is that understanding this is really critical because it's an important qualifier of the human experience. Subjectivity is the cornerstone of human experience, and there's some value in that. And I think we've cultivated this idea that this is a really bad thing, that especially if you're in this room, in academia, we place a high premium on objectivity, right? Scientific observation, scientific method, scientific inquiry, right? Hopper all the way, right? Objectivity, if you can hear that, that's Parker scratching on his scratching board. I'm so sorry. Parker, do you mind? Hey. I have a fake background, so you may not be able to see him, but you can probably hear him. Objectivity, regard for known evidence, right? Relevant facts pertaining to an issue. I know I'm constantly giving feedback to students, you know, do you have an objective source for this? Or is this just your personal bias, you know, your personal opinion? So we place a high premium on that. And I think sometimes when we're talking about our relationships with students and colleagues and just other people in general, what we're doing is we're placing really low emphasis or no emphasis on subjectivity altogether, right? So science is important, absolutely, in academia, but when you're dealing with an example of how you're relating to others, in this context, as faculty to student, how you're relating to that student, the scientific method is virtually useless, right? We're people. We are not a research question. And so I think in some ways it might be a little bit harder for us, you know, because we tend to be more about, you know, well, there's a certain set of procedures and this is the late policy and this, you know, and so it's finding that balance and sort of embracing that subjectivity that is a part of our experience and using that to help close the gap between us and other people, right? There is a dirty word for subjectivity that, you know, we're not supposed to use. It's bias, right? Subjectivity sounds so much less inflammatory. But the fact is, subjectivity is bias, and that doesn't mean it's racial bias or gender bias or things like that, right? But it is a form of bias. And Dr. Emily Cronin from Princeton University coined this phrase. She did some research. She calls it the bias blind spot. I love that. It's beautiful. And what she says is people accept that biases exist in others, but we tend to deny that we ourselves are biased. And I added to that because I think that's true, but I think, again, here's my bias. My subjective perception of the world. I think in more educated people, what you find is that we accept, because rationally we know, intellectually we know, okay, well, you know, the evidence shows that we're human and we're biased, right? So we accept that, but we engage in this self-serving process of minimizing the impact of that bias, or claiming to ourselves and to others that, well, I'm not racially biased though. So, you know, I mean, I'm biased against certain restaurants, but I'm not, I would never engage in gender bias or racial bias. And that's really dangerous, I think, you know, in some ways, even more so than denying all the way around that you're biased, saying, well, I'm biased, but I'm not really that biased, not in a bad way. Right. So, yeah, there's this bias blind spot, and I love that. And I think that's what was happening with that instructor. It also comes from something known as correspondence bias, fundamental attribution error. You may have heard this phrase before. Some of you may even teach this to students. I like to give the example of, if you've ever driven on the interstate and you've been cut off. And when I used to teach in person, and I taught social psychology in person, I would ask the students, how many of you have driven on the interstate and have been cut off by another car? And pretty much every hand goes up. And I tell them, okay, so how many of you, when that happens, have thought to yourself, that poor person, they must just not have seen me, you know, or I hope they're not having a medical emergency or something, and that's why they're speeding off like that. And everyone roars with laughter, because I don't think anybody ever that's their default. We are wired such that our default is that we attribute others' bad behaviors to some character flaw. And so I spent a lot of time in jail and prison. So when it happens to me, I tend to, you know, let some serious F-bombs loose. And, you know, the person's rude, and that's a kind word that I use, right? And I kind of laugh at myself, because here I am talking to you guys about this. I teach this stuff to students. But the bottom line is that's kind of how we're wired. And that's why it's a fundamental error. The fact that fundamentally, this is what we default to in the blink of an eye, that if somebody's doing something bad and we observe that, there's something fundamentally wrong with them, rather than giving any weight at all to the situational factors that might be present, which may be that they simply didn't see you. I know when I cut somebody off on the highway, because it has happened, I told you I'm going to tell on myself. It is almost always because I'm not really a good driver. And so I probably didn't see them. And so I'm like, oh, so sorry. I'm sure they're cursing me out and, you know, engaging in fundamental attribution error. But I'm forgiving myself because, you know, it was situational. And that's basically how it goes. Does anybody have anything so far before we come back to my instructor and student?
At this time, there's no questions in the Q&A. There has been some nice chatter in the comments in the chat.
Okay.
But again, if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A.
Okay. So coming back, so this is where I am going to ask you guys to be a little bit interactive. So coming back to this slide with this email response, and the instructor and I had gone back and forth. This was like the sort of the because I was just trying to get to the bottom of, well, what was the instructor's perspective? But then finally I said, well, she kind of feels like she was treated unfairly. And the student, I should mention, was a minority student, African-American student. And so when in her complaint, she felt that the instructor was being extra hard on her because she was Black and the instructor was white. And I'm not sure that the instructor even knew that because there was no photo of the student, but I couldn't rule it out completely. I went through the course and all of that. So of course, I didn't say this to the instructor, but this was the final email in me sort of trying to get to the bottom of the instructor's perspective. I did not find any evidence, thank goodness, that the instructor was, this is an instructor that has really high academic standards, and she's just sort of across the board hard on students, and also pretty dogmatic in her belief that, there's a late penalty policy in place and we have to live with it, and this is the way I'm going to treat all my students. And so it's not the first time I've had a student not feel very good about their experience in her class in that way. But this was by far one of the harshest, I thought. So I want to know from you guys, in considering fundamental attribution error, if you see anywhere in here some phrases that this instructor said that seem to indicate that she may have fallen vulnerable to attributing this situation with the student to some character flaws about the student. Anything that jumps out at you guys? Anything, and I'll help you guys out. They were.
There's a couple, somebody does have their hand raised. You can post anything in the chat if you would like. A couple things in the chat first. The student has been very frustrated from the start, or excuse me, the student has been very frustrating from the start.
Yeah, that was a trigger for me.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then anybody else feel free to post in the chat. She didn't ask for the extension. She assumes the student lies. She is blaming the student for having a hard time, not being sympathetic.
Yes. So I highlighted, great. So I'm not alone. Thank you. Thank you for validating me here, people. Right. She says, I did not ask to confirm the deaths, so I am not sure if they happened. So what that screams to me is she thinks the student is possibly lying. That I think from the instructor's perspective, she's saying, well, I don't necessarily believe her. However, I'm just going to give her the benefit of the doubt, which she's not really doing, right? If she doesn't believe her, what she's doing though is begrudgingly extending a deadline for her, right? Mm-hmm. This one really, I couldn't even believe it. Didn't even put forth the effort. So now the student is lazy, right? That couldn't possibly be situational, right? So yeah, that was another one for me, right? And all she wants is the late penalty waived, right? So she's lazy and she's greedy. And this student has just been frustrating, right? She's a frustrating person, right? So these are some of the things that really jumped out at me, right? And so, and I don't want to be too hard on the instructor, again, because we're all human. We're all subject. This clearly was a trigger for her. There was something in her interaction with the student. Maybe things were going on in the instructor's own life. Don't let me engage in fundamental attribution error. I said a few minutes ago something that was that, right? Where I said, well, this is an instructor that's dogmatic in her view, right? And so I'm attributing it to her character. But who knows? Maybe something was happening with the instructor at the time too that made her in this almost to me felt like uh, definitely a little over the top unfair. I thought, oh, if you're saying, these things so in a professional email, um, these are some pretty strong feelings that you're not really unleashing, right? And so I did have a conversation with the student just to bring you guys fully in. And the student, of course, said, well, I know you won't understand. Yeah, I can't. I appreciate that you're talking to me. She was very, very professional. The student, very measured in how she approached the subject. But I appreciated her honesty, but she was convinced that because the instructor was white and she was not, that this is why the instructor, she had the sense that the instructor didn't believe her because the instructor in an email said to her, I didn't ask you to confirm it. I'm taking you at your word. That is pretty harsh, I thought. It's not the way I would deal with a student, but at the same time, I struggled because I thought I don't like this, but I don't really see that she did anything wrong. She did technically follow the university policy, but it wasn't maybe the most compassionate way to treat a student and didn't really reek to me of giving the student the benefit of the doubt. And now, because of this racial difference and all of these feelings that have always been in place, I just think that I'm possibly be more aware of them now because of current events, right? In the last year or so, and the Derek Chauvin trial is going on right now. So I think this is even more heightened for me at a level of awareness. That this struck me as even harder, right? So let's take a look at the instructor stuff. She didn't recognize her own stuff. I spoke with her, right? So I said to her, do you see anything here? And she just felt like, no, and I'm not talking about the racial bias. I didn't find any evidence of that. I was honest with the instructor when we spoke by phone, and I told her, look, this is how she's feeling. And of course, this really triggered her. And I said, no, 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 no. No, we need to talk about this, right? Because even though I don't see any evidence of that, and I'm not accusing you of that, right? This is how the student feels, and we have to give great weight to that. We have to figure out, why does she feel that way? And I'll handle that. But understand that there seems to be some other issues here in terms of bias. The instructor was hearing none of it. Nope. I followed the policy, I graded her fairly. Actually, I graded her generously. And as we talked, and I didn't point fingers at her because my perception is subjective, right? And so I really kind of wanted to find out, well, why are you so sure you're right? Right. And then eventually she came around and begrudgingly accepted that she may have been triggered by the common excuse of, the dog ate my homework type thing. Well, I've had a death in my family and I need extra time. But she still said, look, I gave her the extra time when she asked. When she didn't ask, I assessed late penalties. The paper was really late, the final paper. I took it anyway. I deducted this percentage, which was generous. I could have deducted more. And more or less the attitude that, okay, well, maybe, I could have been more charitable, and maybe I should have not been so fatigued by this excuse of someone dying and taking that out on her. I can see that. But I still think overall she was not treated unfairly and wasn't disadvantaged in any way, right? Perspective is subjective. That's her perspective. Interestingly, my conversation with the student, the same things came up. At first, she didn't recognize her own stuff. She's rejected the idea that her stuff, right, impacted her judgment of the instructor. And when I say that they rejected, it wasn't me saying, well, do you think your own stuff affected your bias? No, this is my conclusion based on hearing what they were saying, right? And in the student's case, she's saying to me, I know you'll never understand, and I appreciate that you're trying to understand, but you're never going to, because, you're white and you're an instructor. And so of course you're going to take the instructor side. Eventually she comes around to, well, maybe because of all the stuff I'm going through, maybe I'm not being entirely fair in my judgment of the instructor. Maybe it wasn't exactly what I'm saying, but I think you need to understand that in most cases it is a matter of racial bias, and this was really her feeling. And I had to give that great weight because, she said to me, I don't think you'll ever understand. How could you? And I said to her, fair enough, fair enough. You may be right about that. Can I share my perspective? And she said, yeah, of course. And I said, okay, well, I feel like I understand on an intellectual level. Of course, I have never had the experiences that you've had. All I can say to you is I recognize the weight of those and how that might impact you and why you might feel the way that you feel. I'm a little, I'm struggling here because I didn't see any evidence of that. So can we talk about what you saw that made you believe that the instructor was racially biased? This is important. I want to, get to the bottom of that. And I don't want to just sweep it under the rug because it's awkward and uncomfortable for either of us. Eventually she came around and said, okay, maybe not, maybe not. But I don't feel like she really fully accepted that. And that's okay. She doesn't have to. Because even I didn't fully accept that either. I think that's sort of one of those very frustrating question marks when we're talking about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, that there are going to be biased blind spots. We won't know necessarily that we hold that bias or that we're behaving, could potentially be behaving, consistent with whatever that bias is. And that is one of those things that I think just acknowledging that makes all the difference. And for this student, I knew that she appreciated that. She appreciated that I was really trying very hard and that I wasn't saying to her, that's absurd. You're just saying that, that's a really terrible thing to accuse somebody of. I didn't say any of those things. I really wanted her to understand that I knew she was going through some stuff and that I didn't think that she was treated entirely fairly. And when I explained to her, I said, look, if you'll allow me, I don't know for sure, but I can tell you that we hear from a lot of students that, their family members have died. And that sometimes, and this is bad on our part, sometimes we get to a place where we're kind of like, eye roll, okay. And this has had a terrible impact on you because you've really been through it. And for somebody to say to you, well, hey, I was good to you because I didn't ask you to prove it, that's harsh. And I don't think it's a nice way to treat somebody. And, I'm sorry that you went through that. And just validating her experience and not saying to her, but it's not a racial thing, right? I didn't negate that. I said, there is this alternative that I would like for you to consider, because I think also it might make you feel a little bit better to know. And she said to me, not in that conversation, but she emailed me after a few days and said, I hadn't really considered it from that perspective. And you're right, that did make me feel better because then it made me feel like it really wasn't about me, it was about her. And that was the goal, right? It's not always that nice and neat and tidy, my friends, as you know. So how do we reduce the impact of subjective judgment? Engage in perspective taking. This is supported by research. It's not an easy thing to do, but it does build empathy. It allows for expansion of our own perspective. So by me letting the student talk to me, and even the instructor talk to me from their perspective, I was able to the best of my ability, see it through their lens. Even if I didn't completely agree, I was able to see it through their lens. And the benefit there is my own knowledge base is expanded, right? I'm hearing these, and it was a very emotional thing, right? On both sides, but both people are holding fast to their beliefs. And because they've held on to this anger now for a while and they feel like they're being judged unfairly, it gets even more inflamed, right? And so by sort of holding that space for them and listening and not really, you know, saying, but you're wrong about that. And even with the instructor, I didn't say to her, but you're wrong. I did the same with her. I said, but isn't it possible that she really did lose 3 relatives and was hanging by the skin of her teeth? I mean, how are you managing since COVID? Because I know for me, I haven't lost any relatives, thank goodness, but some days I really feel like I'm hanging by the skin of my teeth, and I feel like a jerk for saying that because it seems like a real first world problem. But if I'm feeling that way, I got to imagine other people are feeling that way. And that was sort of when the instructor was even coming around and saying, you know what? Okay, I could have probably been a little less of a jerk, right? And not jump to this conclusion about the student, right? So it's about perspective taking. Let me understand the instructor's perspective. Let me understand the student's perspective, and allowing that to sort of grow my own perspective, right? Because knowledge is power, right? And if I haven't had that experience, the instructor experience I've had before, so I had a little bit more insight into that. It wasn't entirely surprising to me. What the student told me wasn't entirely surprising either, but it was eye-opening because I hadn't, first of all, because she was so articulate and so insightful, she was a really good teacher in that regard. And it was great because we had this really honest conversation where I was able to say that to her. I said, wow, you're articulating this in a way that I thought I knew, but the things you're saying, like I'm feeling them like in my heart, it's resonating with me. And you're right, I'm not, and she kept saying, but don't be offended. Don't be offended. She just felt her judgment of me was I was limited because I'm an instructor, so I'm going to see it from the instructor's perspective, which is not entirely wrong. And B, I'm not blacks, right? So I'm not necessarily going to be able to see it. I haven't had her lived experience. And she's not wrong about that either. And being able to say to her, you're not wrong. I don't necessarily agree with everything that you're saying, but I'm hearing you. You have to know. If we don't accomplish anything else here, I want you to know, I don't think you're lying. I'm believing you. I don't agree necessarily with how you're getting to these conclusions, right? And just that empathy building is really, really powerful. It's very powerful for you, it was for me when you're in that position, because it really is a position of power. And a way to sort of take control of the subjectivity and use it to our advantage in the decision making. Before I go into this, I see some things in the Q&A. So
oh yes, there are several. Let me see. And lots of great conversation in the chat too, by the way, Dr. Schwartz. So I'm going to start with this in the Q&A, and then let me know when we need to go back. Okay. So Carolyn there's a few comments and then a few questions. It looks like this one's a comment. As a SPED teacher, this happens to me a lot. Not all students are the same. I need to treat each as an individual case, just as that. However, I'm very well aware of students that do not have any interest in the subject and continually make excuses. I think to revisit this and discuss with the student personally and not in an email might have been the best approach. Mm-hmm. That's another way to have the conversation in an engaging manner.
I agree.
This is a question. Are human biases naturally influenced by the people with who they communicate with? If so, how can we work to break down those biases and listen to others' opinions without inference of our own biases?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. That's a great one.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. I'll hold that for later. Let's see. Another question. Bracketing your biases when collecting data is imperative for a study. Aren't we utilizing the information we learn? I think this is from Negus. It looks like he's just at this point just making a comment, but it looks like just saying that we bracketing our biases when we collect data is imperative for study.
Mhm.
So is that something that you feel like we utilize the information we learn from?
I mean, the thing is, when we're talking about scientific inquiry, there's hopefully, if it's well done, there's a level of objectivity in that, right?
Uh,
But when we're dealing with this, with these kinds of things, it triggers emotions, and that's when it starts to get messy, because that's when our knee jerks start coming in.
yes, yeah.
With scientific inquiry, it's, we take our time, and we have these results, and then we sit with the results and what do the results mean, but we've used the scientific method to set up that scientific inquiry, so hopefully there's a level of objectivity built in there.
And this is another aspect, Dr. Schwartz, that I've been thinking about as you've been mentioning, and somebody posted this in the Q&A. Most schools and workplaces require some form of proof of death.
Mhm.
And I was actually thinking about my own experiences when attending a brick and mortar university for my bachelor's, and then just other work experiences I've had as well too, where I have, I did lose a family member, and it was required that I would show some sort of proof or death, whether I needed the bereavement through HR to prove that I was going to take days off to mourn a death, or an extension on an assignment. So I'm wondering, is this something that a faculty member should lay out in their, or an organization? There should be some sort of statement about, if there's a death of the family or you need an extension. Is it in the syllabus is one of the things that I'm wondering. Was it laid out?
I think this is where sometimes I get in trouble with faculty, and I have to tell you guys, I haven't always. I have evolved, and it is an ongoing process. Because sometimes, you react to one student and say, wow, I feel so sorry for that student, and something about what they're telling me rings true. And then another student might tell you, and you might feel like, I don't believe it, not buying it, need the proof, right? Um, so sometimes you just want to have a policy in place. Now, in terms of your workplace and getting paid for time off, in that regard, I understand why
Right.
they're going to ask for proof, right? Because you're going to be compensated for your time off. In the classroom, I feel like we're in charge there. We're the captains of that ship, and for me, I have to tell you, if I was a student and somebody said, my professor said to me, I need you to prove that your loved one has died, and why are we asking for that? I mean, first of all, we need to sort of dial it back, right? Why are we even asking for that? Why do you need that, right? And I think, I know for myself in the past, because like I said, this is I'm a work in progress.
Mm.
I used to be like, prove it kind of thing, but I had to finally say to myself, what do I need that proof for? Why? Because I'm afraid that they're lying? Because, and what does it really cost me, to just, if they're saying grandma died, I used to joke with my in-person students just before exam time, but just before the midterm, I would say, exams should be outlawed because exams are really bad for grandma. Exams seem to kill grandma, and the students would laugh and laugh and laugh because of course they know what I'm talking about. Yes, there's a number of students that will make that up and make excuses to the other posters' point. And we get excuse fatigue. We really do. The compassion fatigue is a thing. Excuse fatigue is a thing. At the end of the day, I think it boils down to, for me, what I've started to do. I'm never going to ask somebody to prove to me that a relative died. I'm telling you, if somebody asks me that, I swear to you, I would like take pictures of the dead body and send them out. That's how, but I mean, I work on murder cases, right? So I can be a little macabre like that, but I would be
That's
like,
true.
here's your proof, sister. You needed
Right.
that proof. Here it is. How do you feel now? You know,
Right.
I mean, it's this kind of, you know, but not everybody has that sort of, not everybody, and especially when they're really dealing with that kind of thing, has that fight back. In the case of this student, although she was very, very strong, she was beaten. I mean, 3 deaths in like an 8-month period. And she was bereft. And even though she wasn't, sobbing and all of this, she was very, very strong in that way. That's how I characterize it, as strong. And composed. I could tell from talking to her and hearing her voice, like she had just been through it, and she wasn't going through it anymore. She was done, and she was not going to be stepped on, and she felt she was being stepped on and mistreated. So I think, somebody else had made the really great point of not every student's the same, not every situation is the same. And so you do sort of have to take it on a situation by situation basis. At the same time, we do need to be careful that we're not making arbitrary and capricious decisions where the students are concerned, because that's where we get into trouble too. And then that's creating sort of an unfair situation. So I think what it boils down to is, as faculty, we have to figure out from the outset, like you said, Emily, maybe in the syllabus, and that's your policy, and for better or worse, this is my policy, and it may seem coarse, but if somebody dies during the course of this course, you will unfortunately need to provide me with evidence if you need an extension. That is not when we're talking about somebody saying someone died, I'm not going there personally, but I wouldn't begrudge another faculty member for doing that, because, if this is how you run your classroom, and you're consistent about it, then you get to do that, right? As long as it meets with university policy. I frankly don't even really want to get involved in evaluating doctor's notes and things like that. It's just, I feel like it's an invasion of their privacy. And so for me, where I got to was, why is this triggering me? Which brings me really nicely to where we are, the perspective taking. Why is this triggering me? Really identifying what those triggers are for you. And it could be in different contexts, but understanding this, that when we're feeling triggered, it's usually because we feel our needs aren't being met. And so what is the need that is not being met, right? Do you feel disrespected? I feel like the faculty member in my example was feeling like the student didn't respect her classroom or the rules of the classroom, right? Are you needing to feel liked, understood, valued, treated fairly, to be correct, right, to feel in control, to feel independent? What need is being threatened for you such that you feel triggered? Because this is usually where these things come up, like, nope, I need proof. And really what's at the heart of I need proof is, I don't think I believe you until I see the evidence, right? At least, and that may not be what's in your heart and your mind, but I think that's how students take it. I'm not saying it's an easy thing, right? Because at that point, then, and I can almost hear you all without hearing you all say, oh, well, then why do we even have rules and deadlines, right? And I have been one of those people that say that too. I'm with you. I'm in this with you, right? There are rules, there are deadlines. So just because I'm saying, identify why this triggers you and why you need what you need, doesn't mean just, to have a free for all. It just means figure it out in advance. And then once you do that and you lay it out, understand that there may be situations that come up where there needs to be some flexibility and it's warranted, but don't let it trigger you, right? That's part of appreciating your own perspective. Don't assume it's wrong or bad, but figure out, how did you get there? And recognize that it is a subjective position. We're a tough group as faculty and as scientists. We really do fancy ourselves to be better than others in terms of being able to be objective because we know the scientific method, we use the scientific method, and we teach the scientific method. But the fact is, we're still humans. Stanley Milgram, one of my all-time favorite brilliant social psychologists and psychology researchers, said it best. He said, as the scientist, you can research the human condition, but as a human, you will never divorce yourself from being vulnerable to it. We're all human. We're vulnerable to the human condition. Therefore, we are subjective. And knowing that from the outset, embracing that and saying, this is my policy, and I feel like it's an objective policy. It's not, but it can be applied objectively. I can tell you it's not, because we're human and we have our specific policies in place because of our own subjective life experience. That doesn't mean they're bad, especially if they're applied objectively, right, in the most objective manner. Allow the other person to lead. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. I know you guys have heard that before. These are powerful words to say to somebody, I understand. I understand. I may not agree, but I understand. And mean it. Don't say it if you don't mean it, because people can sense that, right? Use your own lens to support, empathize, provide a unique and expanded perspective for the other person. Hear them out, but use your own experience. Kind of like it's a really good example with the student, because I was able to use my own lens and say, you know, as a faculty member, this is something we deal with a lot, and it's not nice. And you're making me realize that in my own classes, even I have probably been harsh towards some students because I just heard the excuses too many times, and it just numbs you, you know, to the excuses. And for her, she was able to gain this expanded perspective. It doesn't always work out that way, as you guys know. There are going to be some haters that just hate, okay? The other thing, be 100% present, really listen. One of the things that we do as humans, it's so aggravating, is that we don't give our undivided attention. As the person's talking, especially about these things that we're like, nope, sharpening my pencil so that I can write to you how much I disagree with you, you know, while the person's telling us their side, we're thinking, you're wrong for that. Nope, but there's this. Nope, but there's that. And you're thinking about how you're gonna really, you know, debate this with them. Not good. This is not how you perspective take. How you perspective take is drop your own stuff, know what your stuff is, and put it aside. Put it aside. It ain't easy. Put it aside. When you feel it welling up, say, can't go there, cannot go there. I got to come back and give this person my undivided attention and try to hear what they're saying. Even if you don't agree, listen with your intuition, listen with awareness, listen with respect. Not easy. And I know I sound like, you know, so enlightened as I'm listening to myself, but I want you guys to know that for me, it requires a great deal of mindfulness. I have to sometimes pull myself back because I'm human. Oh, I missed a slide because there we go. Monitor your thoughts about other people. This is important. We can't monitor all our thoughts, but when we're starting to engage in those judgments, be aware. Are your judgments of other people positive or negative? When you are feeling like the judgment is negative, like you might be engaging in fundamental attribution error, consciously flip it. Make yourself consider the situational factors. Even if that person who just cut you off in traffic is the worst, you know, has the worst character flaws on the planet, you're never going to know because you don't know who they are, right? So consider what the situational factors might be. First of all, this makes you feel less aggravated, right? When you can attribute someone's behavior to the situation and say, you know what, they're not this horribly flawed individual, but rather a person who made a mistake. And that sort of helps you to let go of those negative feelings a little bit easier. Avoid stereotyping. So hard. So hard. A lot of Milgram's research. Besides, Milgram didn't only do, the obedience studies, did a lot of really other cool stuff. But everyone knows him for obedience studies. But avoid the stereotyping. Just don't do it. When you find yourself doing it, this is about monitoring your thoughts about other people. It just make yourself stop. Again, go back to, because stereotyping is about something inherent about a person or a group. It just doesn't lead to anything good, right? There's not, almost never is there any sort of scientific support that, the stereotype it just applies generally across the board. And I know when we think of stereotyping, we're thinking of race and gender. These are the issues that come to mind, probably in that order. Cultural stereotypes, but student body is a culture. And as faculty, we have stereotypes about them. And yes, before I can hear you all yelling at me without hearing you. Yes, the students stereotype us too. The students don't realize that we're people with thoughts and feelings and all of that too, In fact, when I taught social psychology in person, I used to tell my students, there's faculty you don't like, right? And they would, share their stereotypes of faculty and we'd have a good laugh about it. And I would say, well, newsflash, you guys might be critical of the instructor standing in front of you, but here's a newsflash: we're people and we have thoughts and feelings too. We don't always like all of you either. And they would laugh, but they would also be somewhat shocked, like it hadn't occurred to them, like, what? Nothing good ever comes from stereotyping, right? And if all else fails, just empathize. That's really how you manage this, right? If you find yourself, with excuse fatigue and all of that, pause and just empathize with the person. Empathy doesn't mean that you agree. Empathy doesn't mean that you're going to just throw all the rules out the window or accept all kinds of things that you wouldn't normally accept. That's not what empathy is. Empathy is a manner of facilitating enhanced communication, enhanced connection. It gets rid of your negative feelings and hopefully it helps to mitigate the negative feelings that the other person has, right? Empathy and understanding really are the key elements to bringing about equity and inclusion. When you're hearing other people, especially we're in a position of power and the student isn't. And I think that is the cornerstone of recognition here. We have to understand we really do hold all the power. It doesn't always feel like that. But the fact is we do. We are in a very powerful position over the student. And I'm really a big fan of, using that power to enhance someone's experience. What can I do to help them feel better? They might be lying to me. I've gotten to the place where I say, I don't care. I don't care. I'm not going to get myself mired in those negative feelings of, I just know they're taking advantage of me. You know what? You can't take advantage of me if I don't let you. So I'm not going to let you take advantage of me. I'm going to give you the extension that you need because it's the right thing to do, because I have empathy for you. And whatever it is you're going through that you felt you needed in cases where students are making excuses, where you felt you needed to go to all that effort, I empathize. I don't agree with what you're doing, but I empathize. And so my role here is to help you learn, right? And to help you have a positive experience. And you're going to be able to learn better. If you need that extension and that's going to help you, I'm going to give it to you. And I recognize that that's not everyone's position, and you certainly have that right. And I'm not advocating that you should. I'm just telling you sort of how I handle it in the classroom and how I see it. I used to get very, very mired in this these feelings of, I'm nobody's fool. You're not going to lie to me. Nope, these are the rules. Very much like, I'd like to think I wasn't as mean as my instructor was in her judgment of this student. But I used to be very, very, strict like that. Like, nope, there's a deadline, make it or you have a 0. It's just that simple. And I think I'm unrecognizable from when I first started teaching, because I really did get to a place. And a lot of that, by the way, a lot of this movement for me has come since the pandemic, where to me, all bets were off. Kids are now at home being homeschooled. People are in the beginning, this time last year, we were just getting to grips with the fact that life was forever going to be changed. It had forever changed. And people were really dying at an alarming rate. And I remember vividly thinking that we're all going to get this thing, and only a proportion of us are going to survive, right? That was how I felt, right? Perspective is subjective. Uh, and so for me, when my students were contacting me and saying whatever excuse they were saying, because we've conditioned them, they better have an excuse, a reason, right? They can't just say, look, I need an extension. And I opened up dialogue with my students and I said, listen, don't even spend any time thinking about the excuse. I'm not going to judge your excuses. If you feel like you need an extra couple of days, you let me know and you got it. Okay. You don't have to tell me why, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If you really, really need it. And you know what happened? I thought I probably just killed myself here. Probably all the students are going to be like, bye-bye deadlines. I had a few who played that game, but they were a really small minority. The vast majority of students, knowing that they didn't have to worry about it, were able to get the work done and were happy about that. And occasionally they may have needed a few extra hours or an extra day, but by the end of the course, they said, I really appreciated this. I had a better experience overall. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you worked with me. I really didn't do anything except say, yeah, you can turn your paper in late. So it really didn't cost me anything. And it meant the world for them. And so I felt like I gained. To be very frank with you guys, I felt like I gained, because now everybody's telling me how wonderful I am. And who doesn't like to hear that? Right. And so this is where I will leave you guys with my little enlightened speech. That is not my quote, of course. This is Stephen Covey. He says, when you show deep empathy towards others, their defensive energy goes down and positive energy replaces it. That's when you can get more creative in solving problems. And I think a little of this would go a long way to some of the things that we're seeing outside of academia, right? Thank you guys so much. Thank you. Thank you. I feel like I'm just blathering on.
No, you did wonderful. There are several questions. So if you do want to have a follow-up question at the end, please go ahead.
That's the presentation. So I'm ready for questions.
Okay, great. And I can stay on for a couple more minutes. So somebody said something really nice in the chat about just kind of the moral of what you're saying in summation. Do not presume nor assume. Sometimes students do have valid reasons for late assignments or a failure to submit an assignment in general. I'm learning a lot from this webinar. Yes, listening and empathy for others are very important skill sets. We cannot become desensitized. Stop, drop, look, and listen.
Yes, I love that.
And I love that too. I was like, I have to share that. Just a couple of questions. I know we won't be able to get to everything. Somebody wanted to know, and I believe you answered this in your statement about really using empathy, but the instructor felt disrespected, and then this person wanted to know if you thought she was being respectful to her student, and I think you're going to say, well, I'm going to let you answer it, but.
Well, her email to me sounded very disrespectful toward the student. I asked the student to please provide me with any email communications between them. So I didn't see any, disrespectful. The instructor did a good job managing that when she was interacting with the student. But I think to me, right, the theme here, perspective is subjective. My perspective reading her email to me was that she really didn't have very much respect for the student, that she had adjudicated the student to be dishonest and needy and frustrating. I mean, she said that, frustrating. The student is frustrating.
Mm.
And, you know, and by the way, let's be honest, there are students that are disrespectful. There are just disrespectful people. You know, again, telling on myself, I have probably been a disrespectful person a time or two in my life. I probably will be a time or two again, right? We're human. So it's, you know, all of this empathy and understanding isn't always going to work every single time to have the desired outcome with the student. You know, we're not just gonna, you know, always have happily ever after. But the point is that when you when this is your MO and how you're operating your class and how you're doing things for the students, it really does have a positive benefit for you. And that may sound terribly selfish. You know, it has a positive benefit for the students too, even the ones who don't necessarily show you that. Uh, but it has a positive benefit for you because you feel better. You feel better about yourself. You know, when we're doing these positive things, these pro-social behaviors, the research is clear that this enhances our self-esteem and our own self-concept.
Absolutely. And I think that this will be one last thing I think we can get in before I have my next meeting. This is a good question, I thought. Is there a productive and efficient way to actively break down cliques in organizations that encourage diversity but don't necessarily show it?
Wow, that's a really, yeah, that I know, you know, I wanted the theme of this talk to be about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I didn't want to give, you know, the same old that we're hearing, because I think one of the barriers to breaking down those cliques is that we start finger pointing, right? And divide. A lot of times those well-meaning efforts kind of seek to divide. There's more division, right? And so I really wanted to focus on this kind of thing, that it doesn't really matter what your group membership is or how you identify or any of that. We all have the capacity for empathy. We all have the capacity to perspective take. And when you can do that, no matter, you know, how you identify, I think that's the way to break down the cliques, to really sort of, you know, get there. It's a tall order. I mean, I feel like I was kind of laughing at myself as I was going. I was like, wow, anybody who like really knows me, like my ex-husband, would be like, who is that? Is she for real? You know, but you know, I mean, it really, and I really want you guys to know that I'm not perfect and can't always live this, but I am really trying hard. And so I'm saying this is what's working for me. And I think it has the potential to work. You know, for all of us.
And I think that's a huge component too, as you're mentioning, like we're all human. We've all been disrespectful at times, and maybe we did it purposely, or maybe we didn't know we were doing it. Mm-hmm. And then to come around from like having that self-reflection and that realization of like, oh, okay, like I have done things that aren't great. But then also have that empathy piece, I think is huge to starting to chip away at that and come together. So yes, thank you so much. And I love this this last quote that you have here on this slide. I'm going to take a quick screenshot of it because somebody asked for it. But just a quick little reminder, this is going to be posted in the CTL. I can
send you my PowerPoint.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah. There are several people that have asked for that as well, too. And I wasn't quite sure if that was going to happen either.
Yeah, I'll send it.
Great. And thank you everybody so much for being here today. And look for this recording in the CTL webinars LibGuide page. And if you need anything, feel free to reach out to me as well, too. I'm always happy to send you guys links. So thank you, Dr. Schwartz, for your time and your expertise.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Take care.